I'm Randall Holcombe, economics professor at Florida State University, visiting at UFM this week, and I want to introduce you to some basic ideas of public choice. Public choice might be defined as the use of economic methods to analyze political decision making. So we take the same methods we use to analyze individual behavior, firm behavior, and so forth in markets. We're going to use those methods to analyze political decision making. Now, public choice was really a kind of a revolution in economic thought back around the 1960s, 1970s, because before that, an analysis of political decision making really fell under the heading of political science. So in making public policy, what economists would tend to do is they would look at how resources could be allocated optimally. They would look at problems with the way that resources are allocated. Some of you might be familiar with the ideas of externalities and public goods, monopolies, and other problems. So policy analysis would say, here are some problems with the way that the economy operates, and then would find some theoretically ideal outcome. So ideally, we move from where these problems are to this theoretical ideal. Well, the problem with that is government might have problems also in allocating resources. We may never be able to get to that theoretical ideal. So what we've done with public choice is public choice uses those same economic methods to analyze political decision making. So what we do is look at the way the political process actually works rather than how ideally we might like to have it work. So if we have any kind of a policy, for example, we might have a macroeconomic downturn. And so we want the government to get involved with trying to stabilize the economy, or we might have a situation of monopoly or externalities. We want some government policy to get involved in trying to take care of that. Rather than just looking at the theoretically ideal outcome, we look at the way government actually works to make public policy. And there are two big problems that we run into when the government organizes public policy. The first is information, that policymakers might not have all of the information that they need in order to find the optimal policy. And the second problem is incentives. Even if the policymakers have the information to make the optimal policy, they may not have the incentive to make the optimal policy. So let's just take something that everybody's pretty familiar with, macroeconomic stability. The economy goes into a recession. Let's think about the recession back in 2008. So in theory, we find there's some optimal policy where the government should respond. But in practice, what we actually found is that experts, various economists, some said the government needs to stimulate the economy more. We're not doing enough to stimulate the economy. Others say, well, we're doing too much. Government intervention is standing in the way of the recovery. So who's right in those issues? Well, that's not really the point right now. The point is, even the experts don't have enough information to know what the optimal policy is. So in theory, we find some optimal policy. In practice, we don't have enough information to find out what that optimal policy is. Take any other problem, public goods. The government should provide public goods. Who's going to provide our roads, our infrastructure, other public goods? The problem is, in theory, we can find the optimal amount of a public good to produce. In practice, we don't have enough information to know what that optimum is. So even if we really want to, we can't find the optimal allocation of resources because we don't have enough information. So that's one problem with the public sector, with the public policy making process. We don't have enough information to even know how to get to the optimum. A second problem, and public choice really emphasizes this second problem a lot, is incentives. Even if we have enough information, even if we know what the optimal outcome is, a lot of times public policy makers don't have the incentive to actually get us to the optimal policy. Now, conventional wisdom seems to have a pretty good idea about this. I mean, you read in the popular press all the time, politicians are undertaking particular policies because they're hoping it will get votes, because they're hoping it will get political support for them in the future. So the public press acknowledges a lot of times politicians, their motivations aren't necessarily to find the optimal policy, but to find a policy that can get them a lot of support. Same thing with government bureaucracy. Ideally, we'd like to have a bureaucracy that's looking out for our public interest, but we know bureaucrats are looking out for their own agencies, for their own jobs. They're trying to boost their budgets. So again, policymakers don't always have the incentive to pursue the optimal policy. So when we're thinking about public choice, thinking about the economic analysis of political decision making, rather than engage in wishful thinking, that is, we hope the government's going to provide some optimal policies, we hope what the government does is in the public interest, public choice looks at the reality about how political decisions are actually made. And what we see right off the bat is a lot of times we don't have enough information to implement the optimal policy, and even if we have enough information, the policymakers don't have the incentive to implement optimal policy. So the idea is, rather than compare the problems in the real world with some theoretical ideal outcome, we compare the real world economy with the real world government to see the way public policy works in the real world. And what we see is that although, a lot of times what the market does isn't perfect, we also understand that a lot of times what the government does isn't perfect either. And so public choice just analyzes on the same terms market decision making with government decision making. So that's the basic idea behind public choice. And we'll be looking ahead to some more specific issues about the problems that we have with government decision making.